Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So today folks, we are going to be comparing two wonderful sets of PAF replica humbuckers. Now, for a good few years, these have been my PAFs of choice. These are the Montys, made here in the UK in London by Matt Gleeson. Now, these have won awards for being so sonically close to old PAFs that reviewers haven't been able to tell the difference. They're just a really, really fine set of pickups. Now, in the grand scheme of pickups, they are pretty expensive. These new are about £240. But in the world of boutique pickups where I live, they're at the upper end, but they're not stratospheric as they were. They're kind of ballpark price for a good set of boutique handmade PAFs. Now, these are absolutely phenomenal sounding and they really suit thin line guitars such as this Heritage. But a few weeks ago, I got hold of these. Now, these are the ThroBak SLE-101s. And these are kind of a tier above most other PAF replicas. They're in a sort of unique club along with the likes of Wiz Pickups and Dave Stevens, people like that. In terms of being so vintage correct, it's actually quite worrying. But also, they're a tier above most other pickups in terms of price. Now, to buy both of these sets new, of course, here in the UK would have to factor in international shipping, import duty, non-sterling transaction fees, VAT, things like that on the ThroBaks. But for me, when that's all factored in, these would be about double the price of the Montys. But you do kind of get what you pay for in terms of vintage accuracy. So these pole screws are custom made for ThroBak with steel that's the exact same carbon content as the old PAFs, because current production pole screws have a slightly different carbon content. The nickel covers are plated by the same company who plated the old PAFs. They're wound on the same vintage winding machines as the old PAFs, so the winding pattern is exactly the same. The butyrate bobbins are moulded with the same imperfections as Gibson's old moulds, so they are so vintage correct, it is unreal. But what I wanted to look into today is, are these kind of really, really high-priced PAFs, are they worth the price? Or can the Montys get so close to them in terms of sonics that they're kind of a bit excessive? So that's what I want to look into today. Now, there are a few differences between these two pickups just in terms of fundamental manufacturing. These SLE-101s are Alnico 2 magnets. Now, the Monty's bridge pickup is Alnico 2, but the neck is Alnico 5. So we are expecting to hear a few differences between the neck pickups on these two sets, just based on the magnet choice. So there are things like that. The DC resistances are very close. I haven't measured them exactly, but I will put them on screen now. Of course, I can't measure them until I take them out of these two guitars later on. But as you will hopefully see, they are very, very close, but there are subtle differences. So we will be hearing a few differences just based on manufacturing specs. But I wanted to hear today whether all the kind of nerdy materials and machining that goes into these ThroBaks is worth being double the price to me here in the UK. Now, one thing I have learned over the years about all pickups, but PAFs especially, is that they really need to be matched to a certain guitar in terms of setup. And when I compared the Monty's PAFs to the OX4s last year, that's one thing that really stood out to me. In that video, I think the Monty's probably sounded better to most people. That's a very subjective term, I know. But that was because the Montys had been in my SG for a good few months and I'd really fine-tuned the setup. And putting the OX4s in and matching the setup, they weren't quite in their happy place. But then when I tweaked the OX4s, they are now the ideal pickups for my SG and they are never coming out of that guitar. I much prefer them in that instrument, but they required their own specific setup. So what I'm going to do today, the Montys have been in my Heritage since last year. These ThroBaks have been in this guitar since I bought them. And I've dialed both sets in to really match the relevant guitars that they're in. So today I'm going to shoot a few things both with the Heritage and the Les Paul. Then I'm going to swap the pickups over, but I'm going to match the setups that are currently in both guitars. So we can kind of hear the Les Paul that's dialed in for the ThroBaks and the Montys having the same setup. and the heritage, which is dialed in for the Montys, and the ThroBaks matching that setup, to see whether the setup is going to make a huge difference to how we perceive these pickups in these two guitars. So hopefully that's the most thorough test I can do of comparing these two pickups. Two different guitars, two different setups, but playing the same things through the same amplifiers, set exactly the same. So it's time to get nerdy. So without further ado, let's get PAFing. So there we are, folks. Now, please do comment underneath. Let me know your thoughts on everything you heard today. Which set of pickups did you prefer in which guitar? I love chatting nerdy guitar stuff with you folks in the comment sections. Now, I'll be honest, I'm shooting this outro the day after recording all the footage, for two reasons. Firstly, because it was so hot in here yesterday, by the time I finished filming, I was just a ball of sweat, as you probably saw, but also because I really wanted to edit the audio together, listen back to it, and really digest it before I gave you my thoughts in the outro. Because, let's be honest, in the grand scheme of guitar pickups, those two sets were so close to each other. I was really surprised how similar they sounded to each other. Now, there were a few subtle differences. I think the biggest one that jumped out to me was the Monty seemed to have slightly more, it's not treble, it was kind of like a snap in the upper mid-range. They were a bit more forward sounding in the way that the ThroBaks weren't. They were slightly more rolled off up top. And the Monty seemed to have a slightly more authoritative sound overall. They jumped out the speakers a little bit more than the ThroBaks. Now, these are all woolly adjectives that don't really mean anything, but that was the impression I got. The Montys seemed to have a slightly more kind of punchy sound to them. The ThroBaks seemed to be a bit more mellow. Now, we did hear as well that the Montys are slightly lower in output, and as I said at the start of the video, they are slightly lower in measured DC resistance, which isn't output as such, but it is an indication of how many turns of wire are going around the magnets, which contributes to output. So going into the crunchy amp, the Montys were pushing the amp slightly less, we're getting slightly less distortion out of the orange. And the other thing that I kind of felt here in the room more than on the audio was, I would say that the ThroBaks were slightly more harmonically complex, I would say. So playing the 535 into the crunchy amp, when I started off playing that kind of low down lead thing and I was holding notes for a decent period of time, with the ThroBaks in the 535, the guitar seemed to want to go into harmonic feedback quicker, and I could hear the kind of overtones over the top of the fundamental note slightly more than I could with the Montys. Now, as I said at the start of the video as well, the other important difference was the neck pickup of the Montys has an Alnico 5 magnet in it, whereas all the other three are Alnico 2. And I think we could hear that too. The neck pickup of the Montys seemed to stay a little bit tighter in the low end, but be a bit more kind of punchy as well. And I would say that's probably down to the magnet choice in that pickup. Now, overall then, would you buy the ThroBaks over the Montys? Do you have to go for the huge money PAF super vintage correct reproductions, or can you stick with just a really top quality handmade boutique set? And I think that completely depends, because do you get what you pay for with the ThroBaks? Well, in terms of vintage accuracy, yes, I think you do. They're wound on the original machines, the carbon content of the pole screws is right, the wooden spacers come from the same part of America as the old PAFs. Like, everything is so vintage correct and no stone is left unturned in chasing that. But are they more accurate to original PAFs than the Montys? And I think that's a completely subjective thing, because all old PAFs are slightly different from each other, and they did change over time. So I would say that the ThroBaks seem to have a kind of earlier sound to them, for the want of a better expression, like a sort of 57 type sound. The Montys are what I would associate with that kind of slightly tighter sound, a bit more kind of punch and snap to them, as it's not more modern sounding, because they're definitely vintage voiced, a slightly later PAF sound, a kind of sort of 58, 59 sound. So that's the impression I got, and I'm no authority on PAFs, so please do comment underneath as whether you agree with that or whether I'm talking rubbish. I love hearing and learning from you folks too. So the lower carbon content of the pole screws, does that contribute to the slightly more relaxed upper mid-range of the ThroBaks? Very possibly, I don't know. So the Montys are fantastic pickups, so are the ThroBaks, and you would not be disappointed with either set. And I think it completely depends on your personal preference. Does that kind of super vintage accuracy matter to you? Or are you happy with something that sounds 98% the same for half the price? And I can genuinely see in the comment section people preferring the Montys, and I can completely understand that. It's all down to your personal preferences. And I think for me, generally when I'm shooting like a pickup comparison video like this, by the time I've finished the playing, and especially by the time I've edited the audio together, I will give you the most balanced appraisal of what we've heard in the outro that I can, but I've generally made my mind up as to which set of pickups are going to stay in which guitar longer term, and am I going to swap them back or leave them where they are now. I'm genuinely torn with these two sets of pickups because I loved how both sets of pickups sounded in both guitars. And as I said at the start of the video as well, I matched the setup when I was swapping the pickups around, but actually in both guitars, the height of the pickups relative to the strings was pretty much exactly the same. So both guitars pretty much had exactly the same setup. I loved the sort of bite of the Montys in the Heritage, and I think that's why I've generally preferred those pickups in thin line guitars over the years, because the bite and the sort of slightly tighter low end compensates for the slightly more sort of boxy low middly sound and the sort of lack of punch that you get from a thin line. I loved how the ThroBak sounded in the Les Paul. I loved the kind of more slightly more relaxed top end, but I loved the clean sound of the Les Paul with the Montys in. And I loved the kind of rolled off, more mellow sound of the 535 with the ThroBaks in. I genuinely don't know which guitar I'm preferring each set of pickups in. So it's a real headache for me as to whether I start rewiring the thin line and swapping them back or not. I don't know. I loved both sets of pickups in both guitars. So those are just my thoughts, folks. Please do comment underneath, let me know yours. Do you agree with what I've just said? Am I talking rubbish? I love learning from you guys in the comment sections. So there we are, folks. ThroBaks compared to Montys. I hope this video was interesting and useful for you. And please do carry on subscribing. I know I always say it, but it does make a huge difference when you subscribe. So thanks, folks, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.